There's an entire generation of people who treat their savings accounts like survival bunkers, and financial psychologists are still trying to understand the specific kind of anxiety that drives it. If you were born between 1977 and 1983, you probably have a relationship with money that's fundamentally different from both Gen X and Millennials. You're what economists started calling a Xennial, and some researchers have even labeled this group a twice-burned generation because of the specific economic catastrophes you lived through during your most financially vulnerable years. So today, we're going to explore what makes Xennials so cautious with money, and why that caution might actually be a form of wisdom that nobody wants to talk about. From the start, you watched your parents navigate a relatively stable economic world. Work hard, get a job, buy a house, retire with a pension. That was the blueprint. Yet one day, right as you were entering adulthood, the entire economy collapsed. Not gradually, suddenly. First, the dot-com bubble in 2000, then the 2008 financial crisis. Two massive economic implosions in 8 years, hitting you precisely when you were supposed to be establishing your financial foundation. The timing of these crashes had consequences that are still playing out. If you graduated college between 1999 and 2005, you probably watched friends get hired into tech companies with massive salaries, only to see those companies evaporate overnight. The dot-com crash taught you that explosive growth can vanish instantly, that nothing is as stable as it appears. You couldn't trust that continuous employment was the default. You had to always be thinking about what happens if this ends. But then, just as you were recovering, 2008 hit, and this time it wasn't just tech companies. It was everything. The housing market, banking system, retirement accounts, the fundamental structures that were supposed to be safe. According to research in the Journal of Economic Psychology, the prefrontal cortex, which mediates risk assessment and long-term financial decisions, is still forming patterns well into our mid-20s. Financial experiences during this period have a disproportionate impact on lifelong money behaviors. This means Xennials were still in this high plasticity window when the economic landscape collapsed twice. You were young enough that these experiences imprinted deeply, but old enough to be directly affected. You weren't children watching your parents struggle. You were adults losing jobs, watching retirement accounts disappear, drowning in student loan debt in an economy that suddenly had no use for you. Older Gen Xers had already established some stability before the crashes. Younger millennials entered the workforce after 2008, when instability was already the known reality. If you're a Xennial, though, you experienced both the promise and the betrayal, which created a kind of financial hypervigilance that's pretty rare. You can take calculated risks, but you never fully trust that stability will last. You remember when the rug got pulled out twice during the exact years when you were building your foundation. And this shows up in ways you might not even notice, like you probably have a different relationship with debt. You were told student loans were good debt, mortgages built wealth, credit cards were just convenient tools. Then you watched people lose their homes, watched student debt become inescapable, watched credit cards destroy lives during the recession. You might have debt, but there's this underlying anxiety that never quite goes away. Even when you can afford the payments, there's this voice that remembers what happens when everything falls apart. Research on financial trauma suggests that when you experience catastrophe during formative adult years, your pattern matching becomes hyperactive. Every job offer gets evaluated through, but what if this company goes under? Every investment carries, what am I missing? Every decision carries, what if I'm wrong? When you're told following the rules leads to security, then you follow the rules and watch security evaporate twice, that gets complicated in ways we're still trying to understand. But here's where things get messy. You also came of age when personal finance advice became everywhere. Max out your 401k, invest in index funds, buy real estate, start side hustles, and a lot of you did those things. You played by the new rules. But then you watched those 401ks lose 40% of their value. Real estate became a trap. The gig economy got sold as freedom when it was really just instability with better branding. Research shows that people who experience major financial loss during their 20s and early 30s develop what psychologists call defensive money scripts, internal narratives that prioritize protection over growth. These patterns persist even after situations improve, shaping how you think about savings and risk in ways that don't easily go away. So you've got this generation that trusted the system and got burned twice for it. You can build careers because you're adaptable, but you might also have this current of, I need to protect myself because no one else will, running through every financial decision, and nobody really talks about this combination. Xennials deal with a paradox that's honestly pretty unusual. You have the work ethic of Gen X because you were told hard work pays off. However, you also reached adulthood when playing by those exact rules led to catastrophe, when hard work didn't protect you from layoffs, when responsible borrowing didn't protect you from underwater mortgages, before we all realized that the system might be actually rigged in ways your parents never had to consider. It is odd to find yourself there, disciplined yet anxious, ambitious yet defensive, investing but hoarding. What defines Xennials financially is this ability to hold contradictions without it feeling weird. You're maxing out retirement accounts while keeping 6 months cash because you remember when liquidity was the only thing that mattered. You're building wealth, but you can't quite believe it's real. You remember the before and the after, which means you're able to see what was promised and what was actually delivered. Perhaps you're not as cynical about capitalism in the same way Gen X might be, since you genuinely have built some financial stability despite everything. However, unlike many younger millennials, you still carry the visceral memory of watching it all disappear overnight. You lost the ability to make financial decisions without running worst-case scenarios. You lost the peace of mind that comes from trusting that the system works if you just play your part. You lost the version of the American dream that actually felt achievable if you followed the steps. But you gained financial literacy born from necessity. You gained the ability to adapt to economic chaos without completely falling apart. You gained a realistic understanding of how fragile everything actually is. If you're a Xennial, you probably feel like you're too cautious for the risk takers and too risk-averse for the optimists, caught between the people who never learned to worry and the people who never learned to trust. You're the person who has a budget spreadsheet and an emergency fund and a diversification strategy, but you also lie awake at night wondering if it's enough, if you've done enough, if you'll be okay when it happens again. It's not a fault. That's the defining feature of your generation's financial experience. In a world where economic crises keep happening with increasing frequency, having lived through 2 massive collapses before you turned 35 might be one of the most valuable forms of preparation you could have received. The Xennial financial experience is worth understanding because you lived through a specific sequence of economic catastrophes that taught you something the rest of us are still trying to figure out: how to build financial security in a world that keeps proving security doesn't exist. Your caution isn't irrational, it's pattern recognition. You're not being paranoid, you're being realistic, and maybe the rest of us should be listening a bit more closely to what that caution is trying to tell us about the world we're all living in now. If this resonated with you, I'd really appreciate you subscribing, but more importantly, I want to hear from the Xennials in the comments. Do you remember the exact moment, maybe in 2001 or 2008, where your blueprint for adulthood officially broke? Sharing those experiences helps us realize we aren't just anxious, we're just paying attention. I'll see you in the next one.